All right. All right. Looks like we are officially live. Hello, whiskey lovers. Joshua Hatton here with ImpEx Beverages. And we are today launching the ImpEx Distillery Deep Dive series, which we've been throwing that name around the offices here for the past 2-3 weeks or so. And then someone much smarter than me said, why don't we just call it the 3D series? And I said, oh, I kind of like that. So it's the ImpEx Distillery Deep Dive or 3D series. Anyway, I want to thank you for joining me on this first event. I'm incredibly excited to have James Wills from Kilchoman Distillery with me. I'll be bringing him on in a minute. But just wanted to let you know, again, this is the first of many events that we're going to be doing. It's really going to fill my time and hopefully your time now and through to around mid-December. So you know what? I'll give the list of events a little later on in the episode or in the series, and rather than have you listen to me blather on by my lonesome, I'm going to bring in our guest, James Wills from the Kilchoman Distillery. There he is.
Hello.
Mr. Wills, how are you, sir?
I'm very well. I hope you're not. I didn't know about the setup. You look very professional with your bottles in the background. Meanwhile, I'm sat here behind the sofa as a whole load of kids' toys. And it's dark here, so I hope the lighting's not too harsh.
No, you look quite nice in this lighting.
Yeah,
everything looks good. Your skin tone, everything. Great. It's 10 o'clock for you over in Scotland. Now, you're not calling in from Islay, correct? You're calling in from Edinburgh?
No, yeah. So just outside Edinburgh. Yeah, I haven't persuaded my wife to move to Islay yet, but I'm working on it.
Right. I know we want to talk about whiskey, and we'll get into that, but I imagine there's a lot of Islay lovers here, right?
Yeah.
Who probably at one time or another had said to themselves, oh, I'd love to move to Islay, right? That's the place where whiskey dreams are made. But as a young family bringing young kids there, is that a thing? Is there?
Oh, my kids would love it. Love it. My wife, she's not sold on the social side of living on Islay. That makes her sound like a sort of city-loving diva, but she's not at all. But visiting Islay is very different from living on Islay. My parents would tell you that because they haven't lived there their whole lives, and they always used to visit, for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time. But living there, especially in the winter, is a different thing altogether.
Well, I look forward to the day when at least I can go back and visit Ireland and visit with you and your dad and your mother and everybody over there at the distillery. So speaking of the distillery, why don't you, I imagine a lot of the people who are watching, they're likely either somewhat familiar with Kilchoman because they've had Macra Bay or Seneg, a passing understanding of the distillery. And then I'm sure there's other people who are just absolute, Kilchoman fanatics. But for those that aren't familiar with Kilchoman, could you maybe go over a little bit of your history, where you are on Islay, why you built on Islay, just give people in a nutshell what Kilchoman is doing on Islay and how that all came about.
Sure, yeah. So Kilchoman is a relatively new distillery. Yeah, I should have bottles lined up all around me, shouldn't I? All around my face.
You really should. It's embarrassing, James, quite frankly.
Yeah, so Kilchoman is a relatively new distillery. My father built Kilchoman in 2005, and we were the first new distillery to be built on Islay in 125 years. And Islay is the sort of mecca for whiskey lovers. Everyone from Islay says that anyway. And way out on the west coast of Scotland. So if you draw a line between Edinburgh on the east coast, and then you've got Glasgow somewhere in the middle, and then straight out west, you'll come to Islay. And island of 3,000 people, 9 distilleries. We produce, I don't know what, somewhere between 30 and 50 million bottles of whiskey a year. At a guess.
Wow. That's what you produce, or that's what you bottle?
As an island.
Okay. I was gonna say, yeah. Okay.
So on Islay, you've got everything from very big distilleries. Kilchoman, which is a Diageo distillery, which produces about 6-7 million liters a year of alcohol, pure alcohol. And then you've got us at the opposite end of the spectrum, and we're producing about 400,000 liters a year. Okay. So Kilchoman's making whiskey mainly for blending. We're making whiskey which is solely, we solely intend to sell it as Kilchoman single malt. So kind of coming at it from different angles. We're much smaller. We're family owned, family run. My father is the man in charge, or he thinks he's in charge. I always say, and my mum's the one that's really got her hands on the strings. And so my whole family works there. And yeah, we produce the only whiskey in Scotland which is made completely on one site, from barley that we grow through to bottling on site. That whiskey is called 100% Islay in our range. And then we also produce whiskey from barley we buy in as well. But essentially, the really unique thing about Kilchoman is the fact that we're a farm and we're growing our own barley on site, doing the whole process on site.
So, all right. So we have an understanding of Islay, general understanding of what you're doing there. When your father first looked to build on Islay, and I know in his mind he had a much smaller operation in mind, did he initially think about production at the distillery being 100% barley to bottle? Did he expect to be buying from Port Ellen, or was there always this hybrid model in his mind?
No, he set out to build a distillery that was going to be about a tenth of the size that we are now, approximately. That's what he had in his mind. So a very, very small distillery that would wholly sustain itself in terms of its requirement for barley. So when the distillery was built in 2005, we had the intention of only using the barley that we grew ourselves. However, he's got 3 sons and 4 grandchildren now that he needs to support. So he's been expanding, we've been expanding, and as we grew over the last 15 years, we've sort of outgrown the farm. So we've had to supplement that barley that we grow ourselves with barley that we buy in. So interestingly, the initial thought was, okay, I'll build a distillery. We'll make whiskey from the barley on site. And then he somewhat quickly figured out, well, I can't supply all of my whiskeys with the barley on site. And then if we fast forward a little bit further, maybe to 2012, and you can correct me on the date, but in 2012, you launched your first core expression, Macra Bay. Let me bring up a picture of that. Let's see if this works. Oh, darn it. Did that not work? You've been practicing all afternoon as well.
Oh, man, I have. It's killing me. Here we go. Hold on. Huzzah. And there we go. Right. Yeah. So you come out with your first core product, but your first core product is made from the barley from Port Ellen maltings rather than from your own. And so I guess my question is, did your father learn early on that the barley that was growing on the farm simply could not support what you were doing, and then if they're going to move forward, you made this conscious effort to lead with Port Ellen barley and then make your own barley a bit more of that special high-end release?
I think there's a few reasons behind it, really. Well, from a pure whiskey perspective, tasting. I should explain. So the barley we grow ourselves is lightly peated. We only peat it lightly, and then the barley that we buy from Port Ellen is more heavily peated. And when you're using a more heavily peated barley when you're distilling, and particularly in those early maturation years, say sort of 3 to 5 year old whiskey, that added peat smoke really helps to kind of add a bit of depth to a young whiskey, and also the people who are perhaps going to be the Islay fanatics that are going to be looking for it almost are looking for more of that peat smoke. So when it came to looking at the stocks that we had in 2009, 2010, really the whiskey that stood out was that higher peating level, because it had that extra weight from the higher peating level that we buy in from Port Ellen. And so at that point, the whiskey was just a bit better, to put it bluntly. And also, I think on the other side of things, my father's always been very, very guarded with the 100% Islay stocks. So, he's much more open to bottling the sort of 50 ppm stocks that we have in the warehouse rather than the 100% Islay stocks that we have. I think that's, it's like that because he prefers to keep that back, and he sees that more as a long-term maturation, suiting that lower peating level more than a shorter-term maturation.
Okay.
That was a very long-winded, not very direct answer, but basically heavier peating level, and also he's more guarded at 100% Islay stocks.
And he'll likely always remain a bit guarded with the 100% Islay stocks, right? Because you simply don't have a lot of it by comparison to the rest of what you do.
Yeah, I think, we're limited to about, what is it? Well, I can't remember exactly, but we can only grow 200 tons of barley every year on the farm. I mean, that's about our maximum. So when we fill those into casks, that's always going to be the limit. No matter how much the distillery grows, we'll only ever have those 200 tons of barley to make whiskey from. So, he's kind of always been that bit more guarded of those stocks, and also, he charges a bit more for it, I guess, because he can sort of say, well, it's going to cost you more if you want that cask. He said that enough times to you and Sam, I think.
It sounds like him. Yeah. So, okay. So we fast forwarded to again, what became your first core product, right? Macra Bay. Now, obviously, those that have tasted Macra Bay versus 100% Islay, maybe not versus, let's say alongside 100% Islay, would see that there's a slight difference in the overall DNA, the style, right? And I think in part, like you had said, it's a lower peating level, so it just comes off a bit different. But here you are, you launched with Macra Bay as your way to tell the world, we've made it. We have a core product. We have something that's always available. Can you maybe go into the design of that whiskey and what flavors you were looking for when creating that whiskey, and maybe some of the speed bumps you hit in trying to create that specific flavor profile?
Sure, yeah. So in the early, going back sort of before Macra Bay almost, in those early releases that we put out since 2009, not necessarily in the US, because I think the first products we brought to the US were in 2010, but those early products that we were releasing, and they were limited, it was typically a combination of bourbon and a bit of sherry maturation in terms of the styles that we were putting together, and we were really sort of toying out, sort of trialing this exact proportions of bourbon to sherry, because we wanted to produce a classic Islay style of whiskey. So we wanted the sort of saltiness, the peat smoke to really come through and marry with what I see as the real unique character in Kilchoman, which is the sweetness and the citrus. So we wanted to balance all of these elements. And for us, we came to this point where it was around about 90% bourbon cask maturation, 10% Oloroso sherry cask maturation. Mm-hmm. And through the sort of trials that we had done leading up to the launch of Macra Bay, we settled on this 90-10 split. And to me, Macra Bay it really encompasses everything that we do at Kilchoman, everything that we kind of wanted to create in a whiskey, because my father came at it from a whole different perspective to most. He came at it right from the beginning. So he worked with a guy called Jim Swan, world-renowned specialist in distillation and maturation. And he wanted to create a whiskey that was distinctly Islay, in terms of powerful peat smoke, but he wanted something that had a light, fresh, floral sweetness to it as well. And so this kind of, to me, embodies, all of that kind of, that target that he was aiming to hit. You've got the freshness, because it's still relatively young. This is probably 5-6 years old as an average. You've got the sort of tropical fruits. You've got the caramel, the vanilla from the bourbon cask. You've got the richness of the sherry cask just coming in on the end. And yeah, you've got all that peat smoke, that saltiness, that power, that people want in an Islay whiskey.
I've asked you this before, on the road, various tastings that we've done. When Macra Bay first came out, it was 3 to 4 years old, and then it became 4-ish years old, and then 4.5 to 5 years old, and it started creeping up. And everybody that we spoke with, I think, got this sense that you were trying to get to a 10-year-old. And I say I think this is how people felt, because we heard the question all the time, and I know I've asked you the question all the time, or many times, but it seems as if you've plateaued it around this 5, 6, maybe 7-year-old product. Do you see Macra Bay remaining as your core product and maybe age-stated products down the road, or are you still not even thinking about age-stated products?
It's a really tricky thing for us to work towards, in terms of, I think everyone assumes that you're only doing non-age statement whiskies until you have an age statement whiskey available. And to us, that's never really been our thinking. Kilchoman was always designed, our maturation policy was always designed. Everything about how we make whiskey is all about making good young whiskey. That was kind of the key to what we were setting out to do. So, the stills, the fermentation times, the casks, these are all geared towards producing good quality young whiskey. Mm-hmm. It also produces fantastic quality old whiskey, hopefully. But Macra Bay, first and foremost, is a fantastic whiskey that compares extremely well with the likes of ImpEx 10 or the Freud, any of those age statement Islay whiskies, and that's not to say that we don't want to move it on and get it up towards maybe 8 to 10 years old, but we certainly don't feel that that's a requirement. I think as it is, you have all of that kind of fresh side to the whiskey that makes it unique in many ways and makes it stand out against the other Islay whiskies at that sort of entry age level. So it's not something that we're obsessed with. I think it's a tricky situation as well from a stock perspective, because we're slowly moving our stocks up in age, but still that 10-year-old whiskey is still some of our most valuable stock, and some of the sort of lower quantities that we have in the warehouse in terms of vintage. So the expectation is that we take that stock, that's some of our most valuable stock, and then price it at the lowest price as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So I don't want to sort of get too commercial with it, but that's the sort of trade-off that you're making, and it's hard to kind of make those all of those things to come together and then be like, okay, here's a 10-year-old Kilchoman for the price of Macra Bay. So there's all sorts of elements coming together, but we've never thought, well, okay, this is good now, but wait till it's 10 years old. That's not really ever been our thinking. We just put it in a glass and go, this is good.
Yeah.
Drink it up.
No. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. To me, Macra Bay is one of these lovely, just great everyday Islay drinkers. That's, it could be just a satisfying little drink that you don't need to think about it. Just, get on with your day. And it's also something that you could pick apart and look for the complexities, because they're most definitely there. And they're not there. They're there despite the age. Age doesn't even matter, right? I mean, all age is going to do for a whiskey is give you a general understanding of where the flavors might lie, because younger whiskeys can do one thing and older whiskeys can do another thing, and they typically don't do the same thing, and that's a good thing. So yeah, I've never personally saw a reason to suggest this needs to go higher, but we hear it all the time. We're always fielding these questions at ImpEx of, are they going to make it older? Because apparently, people put a bit of an importance on age statements, but I think you're right. It's drinking beautiful as is.
Yeah. I mean, that's not to say that the target is not to bring this on in age, because it is, but it's a question of like baby steps, because whiskey's not a short-term thing. In 10 years time, and I would seriously put that kind of time frame on it, then maybe you can expect an entry level 10-year-old from Kilchoman, but I don't think it'll be much sooner.
Okay, well, all of the viewers heard it here first. Mark your calendars. In 10 years, we'll have an entry level 10-year-old.
But also, so that I'm talking about an entry level Kilchoman 10-year-old in terms of like bourbon, sherry maturation, this kind of style of whiskey. If you took on STR, so we started filling a lot of STR casks recently. Okay. Shaved, toasted, recharged red wine casks, and we've done that for 2 or 3 years now. There's no way we'd leave them for 10 years, because they're absolutely no one would argue that the balance is best at maybe somewhere between 6 and 8 years old. It's plain as day. So it really is a question of sometimes people just need to slightly readjust their expectations sometimes, in terms of or maybe the way they approach different whiskies, and talking more about how fresh the casks are, the color, whether it's chill filtered. A non-chill filtered whiskey that's nice and dark in color is going to be very flavorful, and so it's kind of like you need to look at the non-chill filtered category of single malt in a completely different light to the chill filtered lot, because you can tell a lot just by the strength, the sort of perceived age, if it's not an age statement, the color, so
yeah. Well, I want to pour the next drink. Well, before I pour this one, I wanted to ask you if you could go in a little bit to some of the history of, when your dad looked to build the distillery. What were, because there's only 9 distilleries on the island now. When back in the early 2000s, when your dad looked to build a distillery there was only 7, right? You guys became the 8. But comparatively speaking, you look up in Speyside and there's 65, 70 distilleries, right? You go up to the Highlands and there's tons up there as well. And so with Islay only having the 7, then you become the 8th. And of course, now we have Ardnahoe as the 9th. Like, tell us a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, about that history of getting up and running as a distillery in Islay. And just really quickly, if people are playing at home, hopefully they'll be joining me with some Kilchoman Seneg, which is your other core bottling. We could talk about that after some of this history, though.
Sure. So my dad is English. My mother's Scottish. I was sent away to boarding school, hence why I have this plummy English accent. It's hideous when you're talking about Scotch whiskey and people want the real deal. So I grew up in England, and then we moved to Scotland when I was about 8 or 10, and then in 2003 we moved over to Islay, which was my mother's sort of family home, if you like. And so we've always had this connection to Islay, going back to, I think my mother is the 4th generation of her family to live on Islay. And when my father moved up to Scotland, he had dealt in wine. He then moved into whiskey, and he started doing some independent bottling. And he always sort of had this idea to build a distillery. And at that time, it really wasn't something that people did. Arran was the only other distillery which was sort of a new distillery, and at that point, it hadn't really gone that well for them. They're doing really well now. Back in sort of early 2000s, they were kind of struggling a bit. So there wasn't really any blueprint for a successful new build distillery. But that didn't stop my dad, because he's pretty foolhardy. And he packed up the family and moved us over to Islay. And he literally ploughed every single penny he had. He and my mother. She always adds her. Yeah. He and my mother had. They ploughed every single penny they had into building Kilchoman. And that started off with my dad, my mum, a stillman, and a bookkeeper. And we had a lot of help from the locals in terms of drawing on expertise from the other distilleries. We used to bottle some of our minis, and the early sort of new make bottlings. We used to do that at Brookladdy. And yeah, I mean, my mum was very welcome on Islay. My dad, I mean, maybe got a mixed reception. He famously said once that, I think this was in an article as well that was printed in the Eloch on Islay, so it's like the local newspaper. I think he actually said it's taken an Englishman to come to Islay to teach them how to make whiskey. I think he actually said that. So it kind of speaks to, he would have thought that everyone would have taken that as a joke and laughed about it. And some people did. I mean, if they knew my father, they would have laughed about it. But
of course, yeah.
He's got a unique sense of humor. And but people often think that these communities, these rural communities, sometimes they think they're hard to kind of come into maybe and live there as an outsider. And there's a little truth in that, in terms of like, you haven't known them since you were in nappies together. But really, the people on Islay, if anyone's visited there, the most friendly, the most open, most warm people that you'll ever want to meet. And we were very much welcome there, and all of the time that people put into helping us out really made a big difference to us in those early years, because it's tough. You spend a load of money, you build a shiny new distillery, and that's only the beginning. In terms of the expense, you then have to run it, and those bills only get bigger as the equipment that you installed breaks down or was wrong and you have to replace. It's a big undertaking, building a new distillery. So that's why you didn't see it a lot then. You see it more often now, but it's still a tough thing to do.
I just find it so interesting that when someone or a company is looking to build a distillery on Islay, the distillery plans often, well, the distillery plans have to be shown to the Iliocs, to the committees on the island, but those plans always find their way online somewhere. And so, everybody's saying, "Oh, Gartbrecht Distillery's coming. Wait a second, Gartbrecht Distillery's not coming. Maybe that'll be another day." And, and Ardnahoe took a long time to get up and running. And maybe you don't know this, maybe this is a question for your dad. So I apologize if I'm throwing a question at you that I shouldn't be, but were there a lot of obstacles to a lot of hiccups that he found to getting it up and running? Was the simplest thing just, hey, we have a water source and a site, and if we get the sign-offs, we're good to go?
I think because, the truth is, to get the full answer on that, you'd have to ask my dad. But I don't remember there being huge obstacles to the physical building of the distillery, because all of the equipment was installed within existing buildings, so it was all built within the existing farm buildings. We were quite small, so there wasn't huge demands on the water source at that time, or in terms of effluent disposal, or big contracts to find for peat supply or anything like that. It was a relatively small scale project at that time, so I don't think there were huge barriers to going out and doing that. I think the main barriers were kind of governmental ones. So things like HMRC signing off all your spirit safes, and your pumps are in locked boxes, all that kind of stuff. Your warehouse has got a sort of line on it, drawn on it, where it's duty paid and duty not paid. All of those kind of things are a much bigger of a headache than working on the size, the shape, how you're going to run your stills. That's all quite easily done. When the guy turns up with his clipboard and starts telling you that your stairs are too steep or something like that, that's when it gets quite frustrating. But I don't think there were huge issues.
Okay.
Only money issues.
Money issues.
Yeah.
So I've been sipping on Seneg for a little while. Yeah. I didn't know if you had Seneg in your glass. Let me bring up that picture for our viewers. So this was the second in your core range, almost like the sister bottling to Macra Bay. My understanding, I just want to make sure I have the timelines correctly. Excuse me. My understanding was that this hit your core product range globally at around the end of 2015, early 2016. But before that, did it start off its life in duty free and then transition over into your core products?
No. So this started off as I remember my dad saying, "Okay, we're going to launch this product in France. It's called Seneg." And I was like, "Okay, right." He didn't mention this at all in our meetings and stuff. He was like, "Yeah, it's going out there next week. So if any of your markets ask about it, it's a French exclusive, and whatever." And me and my brothers were like, "Well, they're going to want it, and like, what's the deal? Is it always available? Is it not?" And he was like, "Okay, fine, we'll sell it everywhere." And it's this. And so it kind of started off its life as the thinking was it would be, I think my dad thought it would basically be a French exclusive. He'd trial it in France to see how well it sold sort of in comparison to Macra Bay. So he didn't want to launch a new product and it to like overtake it or like erode the sales of Macra Bay and stuff like that. So he wanted originally to sort of trial it in France for maybe a year and see how things went, and then look to launch it elsewhere. But the demand for it from other countries was such that it was causing real issues. So French shops were buying it and then selling it everywhere. So it was decided that we'd launch it around the world. And yeah, I mean, so we don't have that standard like 10, 12, 15, 18, 20, So what we look to do is kind of differentiate with cask type. So Macra Bay is 90% bourbon cask, maturation 10% sherry. And so it's a light, floral, fresh, peaty, salty kind of style of Kilchoman. Mm-hmm. We wanted something that was, in that same bracket in terms of the peat smoke and the fruitiness, but we wanted to kind of bring through kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of that fruitiness and that sweetness. So instead of the like citrus sweetness that you get with Macra Bay, you've got much more of a rich, dried fruit, cooked fruit, kind of fruity element to it. And the sweetness is in Macra Bay, where it's sort of citrusy, floral sweetness. In Macra Bay, in Seneg, it's much more of a kind of cinnamon, tobacco, oaky, sweet influence. So Macra Bay, 90% bourbon cask. Seneg is about 70% sherry cask maturation. So darker in color, as you can see from your glass. I've got Macra Bay here, so you can see very, very light.
Now there was a really interesting batch of Seneg released recently that I think may even be darker than some of your releases of Loch Gorm.
Yeah.
Right, and so obviously you guys don't chill filter, you don't do any artificial coloring. I mean, it's what I find so interesting is, having led whiskey tastings in some form or another myself for the past 10 plus years or so, I would always talk about how, if you see some variation in color in your whiskey from bottle to bottle, just know that's natural, and they're not adding caramel coloring. But I never expected to see such a dramatic change in color. I mean, it really is quite remarkable. And is that just some casks are a bit more active with their color than other casks? Because the recipe is the same, right?
Yeah, exactly the same recipe. The character in terms of the flavor of the whiskey is very, very similar. There's always going to be a natural variance batch to batch, because these Seneg is typically vatted in batches of about somewhere between 30 and 50 casks. So not massive batches, So if you take 50 casks and then you take another 50 casks, even if they're the same ages, cask types, everything else, there's always going to be a slight variance in terms of flavor and color. It just so happened that with recent casks that we've been purchasing from our sherry supplier, they're just being absolutely, some of them have been almost, completely, I don't know what the word is, you can't see through the bottle. So right. Yeah. So much color, it's almost black in color, and people have gone nuts for it. They really have. The darker, I think, as much as anything, kind of the variance in color has kind of got people talking. Our sales of Seneg this year are up like 60-70%. It's mental.
Amazing.
And I think the darker color is kind of, people like to swill around a dark whiskey in their glass. It feels more kind of emotive. So I can understand that perspective, but also I think people like saying, "Oh, have you got the dark Seneg? Which Seneg have you got? Oh, well, bring your bottle around to my house. We'll do a tasting." But yeah, it just comes down to the variances in the casks, So I've been calling up Miguel, our cask supplier, and being like, make sure you send lots of those dark, big influence sherry casks our way, because they're doing the trick.
So Kelly had a question here, and actually there have been a bunch of questions popping up. I'm just trying to place them strategically where the conversation is. But Kelly had a question here about the new make. Now, for Macra Bay and Seneg, and basically anything other than 100% Islay, it's the same peated barley, the same cuts, the same cask entry ABV, right? There's no differences?
Absolutely, yeah, exactly as you say. There's no difference between any of the whiskies in terms of Macra Bay, Seneg, Loch Gorm, Pinot, matured, all of these ones that don't have a reference to 100% Islay. All of those those ones that do not reference 100% Islay, they are all exactly the same when they go into the cask at day one. So as you said, same peating level, same distillation, same fermentation, same filling strength. In theory, exactly the same at day one.
Okay.
All of the difference in flavor, in terms of flavor from that point to the bottling comes from the cask. The color comes from the cask. Bottling strength will play a part to some degree, but essentially all of the difference in flavor is coming from the barrels that it's matured.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is a perfect segue into into the production methods section of the conversation. So, obviously 9 distilleries on Islay, all producing whiskey in a similar manner with similar ingredients, but I think some of your production methods do differ from others. So I wonder if you could give people an idea of your maltings and your fermentation, distillation, so on. If you could take us through the points. I may be interrupting you here and there for specific numbers because this is a deep dive series, so I want to get. I want to dive deeply.
Have you got a sort of hand symbol or anything? You could get something like that again.
Let me.
No, so basically, with Kilchoman, we've kind of got the opportunity to look at every single part of the production process because we're growing our own barley, we're malting it ourselves, we're distilling, we're maturing, and we're bottling. Not necessarily for all our production, but it still, enables us to really look at, the varieties of barley that influence the flavor, because we're growing more than one variety every year. And we very much look at how they perform in the field, but then also how they perform in terms of the flavor that they create. So, right down to the barley that we're sowing or the barley that we're buying from Port Ellen, we will have an idea for the character that's going to give the whiskey. Malting and peating, we only ever use Islay peat. Other distilleries in Islay, I won't name names, they don't all use Islay peat, and Islay peat to me is crucial to making an Islay whiskey because it is very much what makes Islay whiskeys famous.
That's your terroir, right? Exactly. That's literally terroir.
Yeah. So as well as the smokiness, you're getting a huge amount of the saltiness, and to me as well, a bit of the sweetness as well coming through from that peat smoke. Whereas maybe with a Highland whiskey or a peated whiskey from mainland Scotland in general, you're getting much more of a sort of ashy, smoky influence rather than that salty, slightly medicinal side with the Islay whiskies. And then in the still house, we have we play around a bit more in the still house in terms of being slightly unconventional. Not massively unconventional, but just enough to kind of make a difference. So we have quite long fermentation times. So we're up at about 100 hours in terms of fermentation time, which is, you'll find distilleries fermenting for as little as maybe 50 or less hours. So we might be as much as double what some distilleries are fermenting for.
So why do that? Why double that amount of fermentation time? What are you getting with that extra time that you wouldn't be getting if you just did 54 hours?
Well, you're not getting any more alcohol, so that's why the bigger distilleries maybe move it on. But what you are getting is more flavor, so we are building out particularly that sort of citrus floral side in the whiskey. So as you distill, as you ferment, the acidity builds up, and as the yeast sort of begins to die, fall that down through the liquid, you're getting an increase in the acidity, and that comes through in the distillate as that real top light floral note. So that particularly where you're tasting Macra Bay or maybe a Kilchoman where it's mainly bourbon barrel matured, you'll get that real light floral note to the whiskey, and even more so with 100% Islay. expressions that we do, the lower peating level really allows that floral, sweet, fragrant side to come out. It's almost perfume.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So that's sort of the fermentation. And then the stills are very small. So we have the smaller stills that are in sort of, I don't know how to quantify it. They're very small. They're very small compared to the 98% of the other whiskey stills being used in Scotland. So what you have with a small still is you have more copper contact, which means you have a cleaner spirit, essentially. So the copper adds the reflux. So, where you have more copper contact, you're producing a cleaner spirit. We also have relatively tall, thin spirit still. We have a reflux bowl, which is like a bulge in the neck, which again helps with the reflux. And then when we're distilling, we're cutting off spirit at 65.5%. So we're only taking a very high cut on the spirit run. So I always get this wrong. I've done this in Zoom. It's hard to get your hands right. But essentially, there's the spirit run. Here's where we start. Here's where we finish. Okay. Which way do we start? So it starts here. This is the spirit coming in at the top of the run. This is very, very light, very floral, very fresh. Down here, right at the bottom of the run, this is really heavy, oily, off kind of character.
Okay.
We take this section right at the top here. And that means you've got very clean, very fast maturing, if you like. It doesn't need a lot of maturation because there's very little off character within that cut. Other distilleries will collect further down into the run. And that's not to say that they're going to make a worse whiskey. Essentially, what will happen is it will need maybe a slightly longer in the cask to kind of mature out some of those off character that's within that section of the run. However, maybe what you have is more of a sort of Lagavulin or Lafroig style of whiskey, which is a bit earthier, a bit more kind of medicinal influence coming through. But it takes a little bit longer to kind of come through in terms, or reach a balance perhaps. And I'm generalizing here. But essentially, we take that very high, very short cut because we want to combine this heavy peat, 50 ppm malted barley that we're using, which is a big level. And then we want to really build out that top end citrus sweet side to the whiskey. So we want a big spectrum of flavor.
Got it. A question just came in, and I'm so glad that this was asked because I always forget to ask this question. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I've ever asked you or your dad this question before. So I'm going to pop it up here from Travis Williams. What are the line arm angles on your stills? And what's the influence that they play? It's a great question.
I think some distilleries have a line arm which goes slightly upwards. Mm-hmm. Which basically means you've got an extension of the still. So if this is the top of the still and then this is the line arm coming down, so the vapors are going up here and then they're coming down the line arm. If that line armed up, they have to keep on going up. So essentially you'll still get some flux if the line arms up. Ours comes down. So I don't know what influence that plays. I should think essentially what you're doing there is leaving the work up to the still and then taking the spirit off once it reaches the top of the still. I think if we had a line arm going upwards, I think that would be a bit of an extension to the still. But that's my take on it. Joshua, you probably have a take as well, don't you?
Well, yeah, I do. Usually when you have a still where the line arm is going down, I think your point is really good. If the line arm is going up on an angle, that means the still has to keep on working to get that spirit up the line arm and into the condenser, which means it's still cleaning, which means it's removing some of the oils, making a lighter spirit. If yours is coming down, then I think this could be one of the things that plays an integral part to your mouthfeel. With that line arm down, you've got some oils coming through, some of the heavier compounds just coming through rather than working a bit more to go up.
Yeah.
Right. And you know, the folks over at the Lagavulin Distillery kind of talk about it in a similar manner with their line arms going down. They tend to have a heavier spirit. They fill their stills a bit higher to get that, you know, to get that heavier texture. So I think
with all these aspects, you know, with all these parts of production, you know, so you could, if we maybe wanted to get a bit more of those oily textures coming through, you know, you could maybe run the stills a little bit hotter. You'll get a bit more, you know, vapors jumping up a little bit more, you know. So, or you could take a longer cut. You know, you're then going to get more of those oily flavors coming in. So I think with all of these things, it's about a combination of lots of different parts all coming together. You know, so I think you can run your stills any number of different ways. But yeah, our line arms go down very slightly.
And okay, so now we've distilled your spirit, and now we're putting it into cask. Can you go over your maturation? You know, I know you use Buffalo Trace bourbon barrels predominantly. And can you talk about your barrels, your sherry casks, and some of the other oddities that you're playing with as far as cask types go?
Sure, yeah. So first and foremost, we mature everything on Islay. So we have a couple of warehouses at the distillery itself, and then we have some other warehouses just down the road. And those are all traditional dunnage warehouses. And we fill about 80%, maybe slightly less actually, but maybe about 75% bourbon barrels. And then maybe about 10% sherry casks, and then the next biggest cask that we fill would be SDR casks, and then we fill lots of different wine casks. We filled some tequila casks recently. We filled some Pinot de Chiron. We filled Sauterne. We filled rum from different origins, all sorts of different things. We'll fill anything. We will fill literally any barrel. You bring it to the distillery, we'll fill it. And the reason behind the sort of split in terms of those casks that we fill, Kilchoman is not a democracy; it's a dictatorship. And my father is very much in charge of what casks are filled, and he is of the opinion that Kilchoman will be best long term in bourbon casks. So he wants the foundation of Kilchoman to be built on bourbon barrel maturation. Mm-hmm. So we can kind of expand beyond that, but very much when people think of Kilchoman, they should really think of Kilchoman matured mainly in a bourbon barrel. You know, that's his thinking, and you can accent that with some sherry, or you can accent it with some wine casks, maturation. But really, he feels that the best balance of flavor comes from Kilchoman matured in bourbon barrels. And for those bourbon barrels, yeah, we're gonna.
Go ahead. I'll remember it. You go ahead.
Yeah, write it down.
I wrote it on my frontal lobe. There we go.
Yeah. So the bourbon barrels we use are Buffalo Trace bourbon barrels in terms of the fresh cask that we're buying, and that's really we used to buy bourbon barrels from Speyside Cooperage, so, a company that would buy barrels from lots of different suppliers and then bring them over to Scotland and sell them. However, we changed from doing that to sourcing solely from Buffalo Trace, really for consistency. Mm-hmm. And their barrels are very good quality. You know, they make good barrels, which is important if you don't want your whiskey to leak out. And also, our whiskey seems to pair well with their style of bourbon. You know, so consistency and quality of maturation essentially is what we do with Buffalo Trace, and they'll load up a container in Kentucky, and it will come straight to Islay. We'll open the doors on that container, and those casks will be filled as soon as we can. And that kind of direct supply, without the cask being broken down, means that we have we give the whiskey an extra boost. You know, all of the flavor that we want to impart into the whiskey is sealed within that cask. You know, it's not broken down. It's not mixed up with other bourbon producers. You know, it arrives at the distillery and it's it's very much still wet on the inside. There's a bit of bourbon in there. And so within, a year or two, you've already got something that's really moved on in terms of maturation. So that kind of direct supply is hugely important. And then same with the sherry casks, we buy them from one source as well. But it's harder when it comes to wine because it's a bit patchy. So we kind of just pick and choose wine or tequila or mezcal or what else we bought? All sorts of different ones. We kind of
you had me at Pinot de Chiron when you mentioned that. I'm a nut for Pinot de Chiron. So,
well, there might be some whiskey left in the barrels at the end, but when they arrived, there were holes all over the car. So we spent the first 2 days trying to peg the holes in the casks.
Really?
Yeah, terrible.
Is that from them just sort of drilling into the cask to take out some liquid and plugging it in, or?
No idea. I mean, the good thing is that they're very old Pinot Chiron casks. They'll be really, really top drawer in terms of the whiskey. It'll have plenty of that character coming through. The bad side is we're probably going to lose a fair amount of it leaking out of the cask. So we better keep an eye on
them. Before I forget, there was a question here from Bert Hardy. Speaking of maturation, so talk to us. And I remember this when I was at the distillery in December. I saw some new dunnage warehouses going up. So what else? So you're building a few new warehouses. What else do you have going on at the distillery that's new?
So we've recently, actually, within the last 18 months, we've doubled the capacity of the distillery. So we have extended we built a new malt floor, which is roughly twice the size, means we can grow a bit more barley and also kind of improve what we've been doing on the malting side, because our kiln was a bit small, so we've got a new kiln, and everything on that side is going to work a lot better. We've also built a new visitor center, which we opened in February, which was perfect timing. We opened it, had a big party, and then 2 weeks later we had to shut it again. So that could have been timed better, but it's beautiful. And the crucial part is really the still house improvements that we've made. So we essentially built a replica of what was already there and tagged it on the side of it. So 2 new stills, new washbacks, new mash tun, new hot water tanks, new heat exchangers, new pipe work, everything. Because my father built a distillery that he thought he would never see producing more than maybe 150,000 liters, he didn't really build in much space to expand beyond that. He never thought that we would make anywhere near 200,000 liters, let alone 400. So he wasn't really planning for that when he installed the equipment. And so when we got to this point where we were kind of thinking about, real long-term planning, the only way to do that was to basically build a new still house. And the only piece of shared equipment between the two sides of the still house, as we've referred to, is the boiler. Everything else is new.
Okay.
That probably opens up questions. Maybe.
I'm keeping. I am keeping an eye on this. On all of the comments here. There are some really great
quick fire questions if you want.
Well, actually, we will be getting to a Q&A section.
Okay.
Let's transition to this third whiskey, because I'm also keeping an eye on the time here. I realize surprisingly enough, people have lives beyond these streaming events, so I want to be respectful. They don't? You don't think they do?
Well, I do it all my time.
So Barry Hall had. Oh, geez, I almost clicked on the wrong one. Where is he? So this is perfect timing because I'm about to pour some of the 100% Islay. So, again, we're about to go into the third whiskey, but I think this really plays back into the production methods part of this conversation. Why is 100% Islay a lower peating level? If Islay is known as the place where peaty whiskey comes from, why is 100% Islay less peaty than your regular products?
It doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's something that we've wrestled with a bit, and my father's very pig-headed about it. So we've kind of brought up potentially changing the name a few times, but he stuck with it. Essentially, it's called, the name comes from the 100% Islay because it's all done on Islay. It's all done ourselves, So 100% grown, matured, distilled. Grown, malted, distilled, matured, and bottled. So it's entirely done at Kilchoman. However, that it doesn't exactly translate in terms of 100% Islay is less peaty, as you said. So basically, it comes down to the old kiln that we had when we first built the distillery. So the original kiln, which you'll see sort of in the middle of the courtyard when you come into Kilchoman, it was always too small, and the amount of barley that we had to malt meant that it lay very deep on the kiln floor, and we couldn't get enough peat into the malt at that point. So we were essentially limited by the kiln as to how peaty we could make the 100% Islay malted barley. So that's really the reason behind it. And that was obvious from early on, that we were only going to be able to get about 15, 20 ppm, into the barley. So that's the reason, really. So,
but now you have a new malting floor, and you have a new kiln, and you have the 2 extra stills as well. So you've opened up your distillery quite a lot to do many other things. So now with this larger malting floor and this new kiln, do you see yourselves experimenting with peating levels? Do you want to keep it the same? Do you want to go whole hog and do a 150 ppm barley? Like, what do you see happening with this expansion?
I think we'll do exactly that. Yeah, I mean, we've already done some less peated and some unpeated, and this year. So I think there are plans to see how high we can take the peating. And it's tricky because the traditional way of doing it, in terms of floor malting and peating in a traditional kiln building, maybe limits us. I don't know this for sure, but I should think it probably limits us more than it would do if we were doing it, if we were malting in drums or doing it in a more commercial way.
Sure.
So we'll have to see how it works out, but there are certainly plans to experiment as much as we can. And the new still house was designed to allow for a lot of experimentation. So we have the ability to isolate specific spirit runs and completely, so that makes a big difference in terms of not mixing your 4 shots and your feints. You've got a completely isolated spirit run.
So there was a comment here from Philippe Panavong, who is headed to Jack Rose because they have some of the unpeated or slightly peated whiskeys. Can you talk about those slightly peated whiskeys? Because I don't think those were done on purpose. I have a feeling it's a fun story.
No. So in the early, that's not a 2006 cask, is it? Because I think the fire was in 2006, 2007. So in 2006 or 2007, basically me and one of my brothers burned down the kiln by accident when we were left in charge. And I don't know, my dad should have known better than to leave his 2 teenage sons in charge of live flames, We wanted to watch the rugby match, so we built an extra big fire and a spark went up into the kiln and it burnt it down. So that put us out of production in terms of peated whiskey in 2006 and 2007. And then another incident was in, I think it was maybe 2010 or 11. I can't remember exactly. And then in 2010 or 11, I think it was, my father was driving along in the forklift and he hit a conveyor and he just ripped the conveyor off the wall with his forklift. He's a terrible driver. And that meant that we couldn't process the peated barley either. So that meant we produced another batch of unpeated barley. So we didn't peat the barley when it went through the kiln. So we used completely unpeated barley in terms of that went into the mill, that went into the wash back, the mash tun into the wash backs. However, when it goes through the still, it mixes with the low wines faints from previous runs. And so where you are transitioning from a peated distillation batch into a non-peated distillation batch, you have this gray area where it's kind of a mixture of the two, because each time you're the average of maybe 10 or 20 spirit runs all the time, because Sure. And so you have the slight peated influence because it takes in some of the peated four-shots faints, low wines from previous runs.
It's kind of like distilleries putting their unpeated spirit into a cask that previously held peated whiskey. You're going to get some of that element simply because, well, you didn't clean that and they can't clean the cask. And okay, yeah, that makes good sense. So
but it's very interesting. And we also, so recently we did do a completely unpeated. So on the new side, we did a completely unpeated run. That was completely isolated, and we used Kerry dried yeast, which is produces very, very light flavors.
Okay.
And so we had this. Someone gave me the spirit and was like, "Oh, taste this," and I didn't know what it was. I was like,
"You didn't recognize it as Kilchoman at all?"
No, I was like, "Is that gin? What is it?" And it was unpeated Kilchoman with Kerry yeast.
Did you like
I
it?
didn't like it. No.
You didn't like it? No.
Like, stop doing it. What are you doing? I mean, it sort of tweaked my interest, but I've always my father's always been of the opinion that as a distillery, as a single malt brand, you have to kind of try and own your own little space. You have to try and not diverge too much from your, what people know you for. Because if you do, they'll, no one can pull a bottle that they haven't tasted before off the shelf and kind of know what they're going to try or taste, and recommendations aren't so easy to make because you don't know exactly what that is. If we were making super heavily peated, completely unpeated and everything in between, we're trying to be all things to all people. And I don't think that's possible.
Mm. And we've got as soon as we started talking,
about, really heavily peated one.
Well, it's actually been a combination of two. Here you go, more lightly peated, right? So we're and really quickly, of course, Brian Dvorak wants to know if you're keeping both your pagodas, and if you're not, are you as a home in Arizona where I think they'd fit perfectly?
No, we're keeping both of them. They were both repaired recently, actually, because we had some big weather last winter. So.
Right.
It's like a big sail. You stick that up on our headland on Islay, and you've got like 60, 70 mile per hour winds, and the pressure on that is unbelievable.
And so it just tore off, just shoot.
No, just the seams split slightly. Okay. Yeah.
So again, this is what's, well, to be fully honest, the 10th edition is the latest that's in the US, but I don't have my own personal bottle. Rather, what I did is and I only pull this out for special occasions, James, and I feel that this is a special occasion. My two favorite Kilchomans, even though, like your dad, I prefer Kilchoman in bourbon. My two favorite Kilchomans are the Sauterne cask, the 2016 one, and then the fifth edition of 100% Islay. There's something about this one that I find just so magical, and each one has been really fun and different. And with the 8th edition, I really liked that the addition of sherry into it. Like I wasn't able to taste 100% Islay in sherry until then, and it was fun and it was interesting, and I was really happy to have it. And now fast forward to the 10th edition, you're returning to adding a bit more sherry into this one, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
yeah,
most of them have been bourbon barrel maturation, but we have had a couple of years where we filled some sherry casks, and so it's just about kind of showing a slightly different version of the 100% Islay, because it's not a fixed product. You know, it's not Macra Bay, it's not Seneg. You know, we're not working to a set recipe, so we can play around with it a bit more, and I think it's nice to do that. It's fun to do it. It shows off a slightly different side of the whiskey. There's still, you know, there's a thread that goes through all of them, but by adding a bit of sherry, you kind of see a different side to the whiskey, which is quite interesting.
What are your preferences? I know your dad's preferences because he demands that you tell everybody his preferences. But what are your preferences? How do you like your Kilchoman?
Gosh, right. Well, cask strength.
Yeah.
Do you know what? It really just depends on the time of the evening. You can absolutely predict me very easily over the course of the evening. I will start off with like bourbon barrel maturation, and I'll finish with like a wine maturation.
Yeah.
And I'll start off at 46% and I'll finish it cask strength. Absolutely predictable. Every single time. And I mean, there are some whiskies that really stand out for me, you know, that I've tasted over the years, and it's really specific casks that I've maybe tried at the warehouse at a specific time where it just blew me away. Or, you know, the STR is a cask type that I think it works spectacularly well with our whiskeys. But really, it does come back to bourbon maturation for me, and I think somewhere between sort of 8 and 12 years cask strength is really, it's the cask type that just shows off Kilchoman. You know, you taste it, and I taste Kilchoman, and so for me it's kind of emotive for me. Whereas with a wine cask or a sherry cask, you get the Kilchoman character, but you still feeling that kind of most of the whiskey is maybe that kind of sherry maturation or that wine maturation.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay, that's good to know.
Probably doesn't really answer your question. Same as my dad. Do you know what? I always used to, when I first, 4 or 5 years ago, I was like all about the cherry, all about the wine maturation. And, you know, PX for me, I was like, oh, PX, this is great. Yeah, just take a bourbon barrel, finish it in a PX cask for like 15, 16 months. Absolutely banging whiskey.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's great. And oh my God, if you have like PX Kilchoman, cask strength,
yeah,
and you can drink like a half bottle by yourself, and you'll be like, oh shit, that was cask strength. I should have probably gone a bit slower at that, because it's just so easy going in some ways, but also really draws you in. The PX masks the strength to an extent, but it's fruity, it's full body, it's lovely. So I can find a space in my day for every kind of Kilchoman.
Okay. See, if I let you prattle on long enough, the truth would come out. It's Kilchoman and PX. There we go.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah.
So speaking of sherry, we're doing the next one.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, that's a great picture.
Yeah.
Wish I could say I took that one, but I didn't. But that's the 2020 edition that I'm about to pour. And so let me just pour this one. So we've got 2 left. And so I think over these next 2 would probably be a good place for us to do some of this quick fire Q&A session, because we've got about 15 minutes remaining in our conversation. If you want to stay a couple minutes later, I'm more than happy to stay a couple minutes later too. But let me tell you my thoughts on the Loch Gorm, because I've always found this a bit fascinating. As an Islay fan, and I've had them all, and I have them all on my shelves, and I love them all quite a lot. I've always found it interesting that there's not a single distillery, save one. There's not a single distillery that has a peated whiskey that is exclusively matured in sherry casks and released with any sort of regularity. And when I said save one, I mean Kilchoman with Loch Gorm. It seems to be, anomaly isn't the word, because anomaly has a negative connotation, but it's unique amongst its peers as far as Islay bottlings go. And so, can you talk a little bit about the Loch Gorm and the reasons for it? Like, sherry just works well with Kilchoman. Maybe you guys are just lucky. I don't know what it is, but it's always spectacular.
Yeah, so we started. Loch Gorm was a name that was given to a whiskey that was created as a limited edition. So originally it was called just sherry cask matured, and I think it was launched maybe 2012 or 13, and big success. Everyone absolutely loved it. And so my dad was like, okay, well, we'll probably make this a bit of a fixture of the range, and we'll call it Loch Gorm. Loch Gorm is a loch that the kind of distillery looks down over, and it's always a full sherry maturation. Always has been Oloroso sherry. That's not to say we might mix in some other types of sherry in the future, but to this point, it's always been Oloroso sherry, and it's mainly, most of the time, it's Oloroso sherry butts. So these are 500-liter casks, which we're buying from our sherry sort of partner, if you like, Miguel Martin in Jerez. He's always been our sherry supplier in terms of the sherry cask that we buy, and this is the heavier peated spirit that we're filling into these casks, so 50 ppm, and it just works really nicely. You've got the big peat smoke, which really stands up to the real distinctive sherry influence. It's worked in the early years as maybe a 5-6 year old maturation where we've used some hogsheads, smaller sherry casks. In recent years, we've only used butts, and they kind of typically range between 9 and 13 years old. This is a whiskey where you really have a very wide range of flavors. So you still have some of that light citrusy notes coming in. You still have the light sweetness coming in, but then you've got everything from citrus sweetness through to kind of juicy pears and apples, cooked apples, and then you've got dried fruits. You've got spice. You've got some cinnamon sweetness. In some ways it's very rounded, it's very fruity, it's very easygoing, and in other ways it can be slightly dry, and so the peat smoke comes through more. So it's a very distinctive style of Kilchoman, and it's always drawn people in.
Do you think that, because I agree with you, it's balanced, but B, it's incredibly complex. Do you think that that's a function of the various vintages that the whiskey's coming from, or do you find these complexities in some of your single casks as well?
I think you will find it in individual casks, but it's not easily come by, in terms of the spectrum of flavors, particularly at a lower strength. So you'll taste a cask in the warehouse and it'll blow your mind, and then you'll add water to it, and it kind of loses its way, So we've always bottled Loch Gorm at 46%, which is by most people's standards a very good solid strength, non-chill filtered, everything else. But in our range, it's maybe where we bottle a lot of cask strength or 50%. So, it's sort of on the lower end in terms of strength. So you need to find a balance of casks that character comes through at that slightly lower strength as well as the cask strength. So yeah, you'll find a cask in the warehouse that has a huge range of flavors and is spectacular. But you usually won't find them in great numbers, and some of those casks maybe won't translate to a lower strength very well. So we tend to mix up the vintages for that reason, but also because our sherry stocks are quite patchy as well. So we have some years where we have a lot of stocks and some years where we have hardly any. So we need to mix them up a bit. Everyone does that. It's just we slightly bend the rules by telling you about it.
Well, it's transparency. That's transparency is a good thing. It's unfortunate that sometimes the Scotch Whisky Association doesn't approve of some of the transparency measures here.
No, they write us a letter very often saying, you guys did it again. You ignored our letter from last year. We got the internet. But no, they're yeah. A slap on the wrist for that. So we have told people our preference is always to tell people exactly what is in the bottle. However, the SWA is a huge force for good in the Scotch whisky industry. Without them, Scotch whisky would not be where it is today. However, sometimes it does shackle you slightly. So we bend the rules, but try not to break them.
So you brought up cask strength a few times, and there's a question up here we could see. What are the chances of a cask strength Loch Gorm in 2021 or beyond?
I would say it's going to happen at some point. I think probably next year you're more likely to see a cask strength Seneg, potentially, rather than a cask strength Loch Gorm. But I don't know. You're talking to the wrong person. I'm just the flunky that goes out and makes up stories about me.
There's more and more people asking for it. So we'll save this recording for your dad. Make sure he watches it in full so that he can. So look, we've only got about 8 more minutes left. There's a 5th whiskey, and James, I've had this bottle since it hit the U.S. and I've been waiting to open it for this occasion alone. Let me bring up that picture. There we go. So this is the it's been in conversation throughout. Well, we've brought it up throughout this conversation. The idea of older Kilchoman, and in this one, it's a 14-year-old single cask. I think this was either the 30th or 32nd cask you've ever filled. And this was in honor of the 10-year partnership between Kilchoman and ImpEx beverages. Yeah. And so, we went out to the distillery with you and your dad and the whole ImpEx team to pick a cask. And the last time I tasted it was back in the distillery. So I'm excited to taste it again. I'd love for you to share what you think Kilchoman is doing 10, 12, 14 years of age. If most people are familiar with Macra Bay at 5 or 6 years old, or Seneg at 5, 6 years old, etc., where do you see your whiskey going as it gets older?
So if you compare a sort of 14-year-old, single cask with the sort of core range whiskeys that we're putting out, and this will compare mostly with Macra Bay, with Macra Bay, you've got a lot of kind of salty maritime influence coming through. You've got that fruitiness, but if you compare it to a 14-year-old Kilchoman. It's suddenly Macra Bay looks a little bit thin in some ways. You know, you with a 14-year-old, you've got a lot more built out in the middle. You've got with Macra Bay, you've got big punchy peat smoke, and you've got you know, citrus, fruity character. You've got some caramel, some vanilla as well, from the bourbon and the richness from the sherry. And you've kind of got this kind of group of flavors which work extremely well together. Overall, it's fresh, it's vibrant, it's distinctive. However, with a 14-year-old Kilchoman, you've got all of those things, and then 20 other things in the middle. You know, so you've got, particularly for me, you've got a lot more complexity on the fruity side. So you've got more tropical fruits coming through, more ripe fruit, not necessarily cooked fruit or dried fruit, but you've got a huge range of everything from, you know, mango, pineapple, all those kind of pear drop kind of influence. That's all really coming through. The peat smoke is dampened down a little bit with those extra years in cask, but you've really just got a more complex, more complete Kilchoman in many ways. But also, you know, you've moved away from the Kilchoman spirit in some ways, you know, the Kilchoman distillate. So you won't have that same vibrancy. What I love about Macra Bay is it's vibrant. It's really sort of distinctively fresh. With this, you've got a much more of a whiskey in its typical sense.
Yeah, there's you know, with the older whiskeys, you always get this slight elegance to it, and I can't put a note onto it. All I can say is there's something older whiskeys do that younger whiskeys don't do or can't do, and vice versa. And there's always this note with older whiskeys that I can never put a fine point on it. All I can say is, oh yeah, that one's a bit older. And right, and with Kilchoman, now this is the oldest Kilchoman that I take that back. This is the second oldest Kilchoman that I've ever had. But what I found Kilchoman doing that I think is so very interesting is there's a slight minerality coming through that hasn't really come through in the younger whiskeys. Yeah. And it reminds me a bit of that, you know, the later teen Port Ellens, right? That they start to get that minerality coming through, and then when Port Ellen starts getting into the 30 years of age, it's too much for me. Like, this is falling into that wheelhouse, and I think it's just so pretty and so elegant and so fruity. Yeah, really quite.
I think it will. I mean, you know, there's an element of refinement that you get with age. You know, so you've got that, you know, elegance, refinement coming through, certainly. But I tell you, there's room. There's always room for the feisty young buck coming in with his curly hair all over the place. You know.
Yep, I hear you. Curly hair all over the place.
No, so I think it's interesting, and people will certainly be. I think they'll be impressed with the older ages that we do put out. But sadly they will be quite few and far between. And Sam and yourself, Chris, and all the guys at ImpEx, you know, we've worked with you guys for a while now, and you always manage to sort of tease the best casks out of the warehouse for your sort of ImpEx Evolution range. I don't know quite how you do it. It's persistence. Persistence is obviously pays off, I think, because every time I talk to you guys, well, have you got anything good in the warehouse? Taste anything good? And I think it's that persistency. You always catch me when I've just come out of the warehouse and we've tasted something really good. Oh, that might suit them. You know,
you explained before how you know, how easy it is to guess what you're going to be drinking. We just know when to ask you the question. We know when the yes will come.
Yeah. Now, 5 pints in, you know, so I can remember. I'm drunk enough to commit to something that I wouldn't normally, but I'm not so drunk that I'll forget.
Yeah, 6th pint. all bets are off. You'll promise the world, but nothing comes to fruition.
Yeah. I will laugh in your face in the morning and say, yeah, done it.
So we've got just a few questions that came in as we're winding down here. And here we go. What are your plans for a dwindling Islay peat supply? And do you have any long-term plans in place, or do you take it day by day? And is dwindling Islay peat a thing too? I think that's up for discussion as well.
It's a tough position for us to be in, because there's no two ways about it that taking peat out of the ground is not good for the environment. You know, so it's pretty black and white in terms of that perspective. What I would say is that, you know, so for the 4 tons of barley that we're peating in a batch, we use about 2 wheelbarrows worth of peat. You know, so we're not talking vast mountains of peat. You know, it's pretty small. And peat use on Islay is about at its record low. You know, so throughout, even though the distilleries are all producing probably more whiskey now than they have done for the last 50 or 100 years, peat, the use of peat is still, you know, very, very low in comparison to previous years. And that's nothing to do with whiskey. It's to do with the population on Islay falling, and also the way that we heat our homes, the way that we cook our food, you know, has changed. You know, we're not using peat. So the days where every single household on the island would have a peat bank and would be cutting peat and using more peat in a day than we use in a week, you know, as a single household, those days are long gone. So in terms of taking peat out of the ground, no questions, is bad for the world. We're using it in very small amounts, and we're using it for a very good cause. But
that's true.
The dwindling supplies, I mean, I'm not an expert in it, but there have been studies done which seem to suggest there is plenty. But I still suspect that we're using it more quickly than it's being produced, sadly. So it is something that will need to be addressed in my lifetime for sure.
Yeah. So another one here from Pure Boy. 2 requests. Your new make is delicious, unlike anything else I've tried. Any chance to make that a special release? Also, your bramble liqueur is amazing and unique. Please release it stateside.
So the new make, whenever I suggest that we should sell our new make, my dad says to me, I built a whiskey distillery, not a spirit distillery. And so that's the end of that conversation. And in terms of the bramble, I don't think we can sell it in the States because it's a 50 cl bottle. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, you'd have to make it either a 375 or a 75 cl or 700 ml bottle. Yeah, 50 cl does not work.
You guys make it really hard for yourselves. Maybe.
I know. We are our own worst enemy, James.
Yeah. So if you come to the distillery, you can have as much as you want of both, as long as you consume it on site. In fact, I can't begin to encourage binge drinking. I didn't say that. Drink responsibly.
I think the last time I was there, I picked up a new bottle. So, you know, I
so
agree with
you. Get around to Joshua's house; he'll pour you a large dram.
There you go. If you ever find yourself in Guilford, Connecticut, Pure Boy, I will pour a little bit for you. So I think I covered all of the questions here. I just want to make sure I haven't left anyone out. Oh, actually, yeah, here we go. So Jonathan Mark's wanting to know about the continued tariffs and how it's affecting whiskeys coming into the USA. So yeah, so we've been working with you to absorb those tariffs. I don't. What are your thoughts there?
Well, yeah. So as Joshua said, you know, we have a very good relationship with Joshua and the guys at ImpEx, and they've really stepped up and made a huge commitment to absorb half of the tariffs, and we're also absorbing half of those tariffs as well. So between the two of us, Kilchoman and ImpEx, we've managed to absorb those tariffs at the moment. I mean, it's having an effect for sure, because I think it's left customers feeling like they're overpaying for their whiskey, where for Kilchoman they probably aren't, but it doesn't change the fact that they walk away from the Scotch whiskey section because they feel like everything's got 25% more expensive there. So it's bad, essentially. It's really not good for the whiskey consumer in the US, because I think less whiskey will come there, essentially, especially less of the special stuff, so it's bad for you, it's bad for us, because I've heard various figures thrown around, but they're all bad in terms of sales, exports to the US. So I don't think anyone's really winning at this point, but
yeah, I think exports to the US of Scotch whiskey is down by 39% because of the tariffs, which is it's frightening. And so I've said it 100 times, and I'm sure Sam has said it 100 times, but we're so thankful to you for working with us and splitting that tariff, because 25% doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is a whole heck of a lot of money.
It's purely on single malt, isn't it?
Yeah, it's is it on single malt? I think it's just on single malt. I don't think it's on blend.
Yeah. So it's literally hurting the smaller guys perhaps more than the bigger guys. If they really wanted to make money or do whatever, they should have put it on all Scotch whiskey, not bloody single malt.
Right.
So anyway, if we go too far into this, we'll get political.
Yeah. We can't end in a conversation about cul-de-sac. No, this is what will. Oh wait, here we go. So Jess just got Fino cask in the UK. Anything you can share with her before she opens the bottle?
Anything I share with you? Well, full Fino maturation. So in comparison to Loch Gorm, it's not rich. It's not got that same sort of dried fruits, cooked fruits influence. It's much lighter, slightly more kind of saline. That sounds terrible. There's a descriptive word. Much more kind of green apples. That kind of influence coming through. So as a batting of only 12 barrels. So we only had 12 Fino sherry casks in the warehouse. So this is the only. I think those were the only Fino sherry casks we had in the warehouse. So once this is gone, there'll be no more. And it's gone down extremely well. People have loved it so far. So I hope you do as well.
Do you find it's coming off drier compared to Loch Gorm?
In some ways, a lot of the time I get a dry note on the back of Loch Gorm as well. It's very. It doesn't drink to me like someone says, here's a sherry matured Kilchoman or a sherry matured whatever. You always assume it's Oloroso or PX or a combination of the two.
Sure.
Whereas with a Fino, it's just a completely different animal. So almost referring to it as just Fino matured is easier. So it's nice. I like it a lot. And I tasted it at cask strength, and it was really, really good. And at 46%, you lose a little bit, but you really don't lose too much. I think it's a fantastic version. I wish we'd filled more in the years between 2014 and 16. The casks were, and now. But there we go. We've been filling everything else.
Well, let's end it on this. Well, first off, you've got oh geez. Okay, if you have a couple more minutes, there's some good questions coming in, and I don't want to ignore anybody here. So Jacob here, and I think this is a fairly simple question, but maybe not. He's he's really interested in finding what the most peated Kilchoman is, and I think the fact of the matter is, you have either heavily peated or you're lightly peated 100% Islay, but peat can also be perceived different. So in your mind, what is the peatiest tasting Kilchoman that you can maybe suggest to Jacob?
I would recommend Macra Bay. The bourbon cask allows the peat to come through the most. What I would say is that, to Joshua's point, the peat smoke comes through in different ways, different cask maturations, different ages, different strengths. So actually, so Macra Bay doesn't really nose as there's much peat, but tastes as there is, whereas Loch Gorm, which is sherry matured, is kind of the opposite. Or I think I might have got myself confused there. But essentially, the two can play out in very different ways. So you can have the smoke coming through a lot of the nose. You can have more peaty. You can have more smoky influence. So it plays out in different ways. But I would say Macra Bay is the one to go for.
Yeah, I think that's
all over the ship, all over the place.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because the sherry in Loch Gorm seems to round out all of the peaty edges and kind of tamp down the smoke with all that sweetness. It sort of balances it out.
Yeah.
This is a very, very important question. Do you see that? Do I need to read it? Of course, it's
Jared must have just got off the ferry at that point, because he was a bit late. He made it in time to try to take a Pinot cask. No, I genuinely think that Pinot cask went into the vatting. So
okay. Did you refill any of the?
Yeah,
those you did. You refilled those casks. Yeah, Brian DeBoer had that question. Okay. Yeah.
We tend to refill everything that we use once, so automatically they get refilled, and then when it comes up to a second time, we'll make a call on it.
Do you refill them with new make, or do you refill them with bourbon cask matured Kilchoman?
No, we refill them with new make most of the time. Yeah.
Okay.
So it depends. If we use a PX cask for finishing, then we might use it again for finishing, or we might. A lot of the time with very distinctive cask types, we'll use them first as a finish, and then we'll fill them with new make.
Okay. All right, this may be the last question here. From Travis Williams. Did you ever experiment with your own Kilchoman blends at home? If so, what is one you enjoyed? Travis did a little 2014 cask strength with some Kilchoman port. Ooh, that's an interesting combination.
I have tried it. I find it easier when you have two very different cask types. So for example, Macra Bay and port. If you have a bottle of port matured Kilchoman and a bottle of Macra Bay, and you just put a drop of port in the Macra Bay, then you've got something that's quite noticeably different, and maybe will come off quite good. But the more subtle things, it's quite hard to do at home, and it never really works out that well. Particularly because when I'm trying to do it, I'm usually half a bottle in, so a bit heavy-handed with things. What Travis was saying, the port matured and Macra Bay is essentially Amburic, which was a limited edition we did earlier.
Right, there you go. Yeah.
So that's one that we thought worked so well that we did it ourselves, albeit by accident. Yeah.
Okay. And speaking of Ambura,
yeah,
people are absolutely loving it. So, there's another question here, but I'm going to answer that one. It's you'll understand why at a later date. But James, thank you so much for staying up. I understand it's almost midnight over there in Scotland. So, well, it is Scotland. You're right. The painting behind you is of Ireland, but you're in Scotland. Yeah. Okay.
Ireland. Yeah. I married a Mick. So. Yeah.
This stream got really racist really fast, so I'm glad we offended.
Yeah. You know what? In Ireland, so they refer to me as English, which really pisses me off, which is fine. But they always say, so my father-in-law starts every sentence about an Englishman with, he's English, but, and yeah, so it really gets on my nerves. But he probably won't watch it, so it's okay.
Oh, okay, and so that's why you're going fast.
I'm just slating him. I'm slating him, and knowing full well that he'll never see this, so I'll get away with it. I'm fineless like that.
So I shouldn't email this to him later. Got it. Okay.
Probably not.
All right. Well, James, thank you again, and thanks to everybody who's watching on YouTube, watching on Facebook, sending out questions. This has been fantastic. For those of you that are still on, I just want to go down a quick little series of events. So on Wednesday, we'll have Laura Davies, the head distiller at Penderyn. That's Wednesday, October 21st. Wednesday, October 28th, we'll have David Keir of Glenallachie Distillery. On Wednesday, November 4th, we'll have Mitch Wilson talking about Black Tot rum. So if you love rum, please join us. If you're curious about rum, please join us. If neither of those apply to you, please join us. On Sunday, November 8th, we'll have Tal and Tomer from the Milk and Honey Distillery out of Tel Aviv. On Wednesday, November 7th, we'll have Chris Udy talking about Oishi and Fukano. Those are Japanese rice-based whiskeys. On November 18th, also Wednesday, Ollie Chilton, master blender of Port Ascaig. Wednesday, December 2nd, Ollie Chilton comes back to talk about single malts of Scotland, independent bottling. And Wednesday, December 9, Chris Udy comes back to talk about Matsui. So Matsui, Japanese single malt, Kuriyoshi, Japanese pure malt, and Totori, Japanese blend. And then finally, on Wednesday, December 16th, we'll have Jason Johnston-Yellen coming to talk about single cask nation. So I get to interview my own business partner. That'll be fun. So there you go. So James, for the next, if you want to join all of these people for the next few Wednesdays or Sundays, we expect you. And
I probably will. I'll be the one like typing away really mean questions that you come up. No. I mean, I'd be really interested to listen to all of them. So I hope people do join. So you guys have got a great portfolio of brands that there's lots to learn about, which is a nice thing.
Cheers. Thank you. And thank you for kicking off this series. I hope you found it a success. People seem to be loving it. And
deep dive.
That's it. Yeah. What's that?
Deep dive with Joshua Hatton.
Deep dive. 3D. All right.
All right. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Yeah. Thank you, James. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.